Welcome to the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum's Zoom series, Trolleyology. My name is Kristen Fredrickson, and I'm the Manager of Public Programs and Outreach here at the museum. Thank you guys for joining us today. Welcome back to all of you who we have seen many times before. This series features programs on Pennsylvania transit history topics, stories about the trolley era, stories of art collection that you can experience from home. So usually on a Tuesday or a Wednesday, we're hosting these, and we're going to continue them as long as we have presenters and shows that fit our mission. So if you have something that you would like to share, anything about Pennsylvania, trolleys, trolley era, cities where our streetcars come from, please reach out. You should have my email address in the confirmation email that you got. And if you have a program that doesn't quite fit those guidelines, kind of like this one, please reach out anyway, because we are open to expanding and sharing other transit history stories. So we've got a full list of upcoming presentations on our website at patrolley.org, which I'll put in the chat in just a minute so you can click on it. And I want to extend a very special thank you to those of you who donated while registering for tonight's presentation, and those of you who've made donations through our website this year. We really, really appreciate your support of the museum, especially our virtual outreach programs. Okay, and for those who are new to the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum, we were established in 1954 as the Art and Electric Railway by a group of trolley enthusiasts called the Pittsburgh Electric Railway Club. And the museum opened a few years later in 1963, and we're located along the former route between Pittsburgh and Washington, PA. We've got over 50 trolleys and electric railway cars here, about 20 of them operate. And now we've got over 30,000 visitors per year who are taking our 4-mile scenic ride at the museum. And I mentioned we had the West Penn Trolley Meet the weekend before last, and we are open with our summer hours. So June, July, August, we're open Tuesday through Sunday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., though the last full experience begins at 3 p.m. And come see us. Come see us. We're only closed on Mondays. So whenever your vacation takes you through southwestern PA, we'll be here. And this is a photo from one of our trolley parades during the West Penn Trolley Meet. This was the Western Pennsylvania and Pittsburgh Cars Parade. You see everybody lined up on the street there. And a couple other notes from the meet. It was so awesome to see everybody, many of you who I had never met in person before, or maybe only once. The photo on the top left there is from our night photo shoot, which was the most well-attended one that I can ever remember at the museum. So that was fun. And the bottom left, we had our Anything on Wheels event at the same time. So you can see one of our volunteers, his bus is there, Ralph Saccone, and some other cars with PCC 4004 going by in the background. And then on the right-hand side, many of you may recognize Art Ellis, who is 104 years old and operated our Red Arrow 78 car in the parade during our Philadelphia cars. Well, actually, it was Philadelphia and other cities parade. So I don't know what the world record is for the oldest person to operate a streetcar, but I feel like 104 is like pretty good. So and then lastly, I wanted to mention our next fun event coming up, other than some of our concert series going on over the summer, but our next really, really big event is the Washington County Fair. So if you weren't able to come out for the West Penn Trolley Meet and you want to see a bunch of streetcars running at the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum, come out to the Washington County Fair August 10th to 17th. We're basically a transit system. We run up to 7 cars at once during that week and well into the night, usually at 10 or 11 o'clock at night. So it is a lot of fun. And you can see there in that middle bottom photo, the sea of cars that people don't want to park in, so they can park in one of our lots and the trolley will drop you off right at the front of the fairgrounds. So that's what's coming up here at the Trolley Museum. And now I would like to introduce today's presenter, Matt Nawn. Matt is no stranger to Trolleyology presentations, having presented on various topics over the past few years. And along with being a PTM member, he serves as the Director of Development for the Baltimore Streetcar Museum. He's a trustee of the National Capital Trolley Museum, and he's a board member of the Heritage Rail Alliance. His full-time occupation is serving as the Chief of Technical Services at the Federal Transit Administration. And his professional experience actually includes having served as a consultant for a project to determine the suitability of a former Newark PCC car for heritage operation. And as I mentioned earlier, we will have a question and answer session with the presenter at the end of the program, but the chat box will be open. So feel free to enter questions or comments during the show, and we'll be able to read through those at the end. And just to note, this program is being recorded and will be shared on our YouTube within the next few weeks. And other than that, we're going to keep our microphones muted. At this time, I'm going to ask everyone to turn their videos off as well, just so we can minimize distractions. And I will invite you to turn those back on at the end. All right, Matt, if you are ready, take it away.
All right. Thanks so much, Kristen. All right. Well, good evening, everyone. And Kristen, I'm really honored to be able to present tonight on the topic of the Newark City Subway PCC cars. This is really a follow-on topic, and a lot of credit belongs to Aaron Isaacs of the Minnesota Streetcar Museum, who sort of inspired this as he talked about the long careers of the Twin City lines, Minneapolis, Minnesota, PCC cars. So following on that, Chris and I had a chat, and I said, let's talk about where 30 of the cars went after their days in the Twin City lines. If I can get my screen on freeze, here we go. All right, so first, Kristen already covered a little bit about me, so we can don't have to go through that again. What we're going to talk about today, the purpose. This was a system, one line, 30 cars. That in itself may lend someone to think, how could you talk about 30 nearly identical PCC cars? The line itself is a really interesting history, and I've tried to add tonight some interesting features. We're going to look a little bit about Newark itself, through the context of the cars, and you can see how it changed over time, how the system changed. And I've tried to find some more unusual but factual anecdotes about the system to add a little life to what, at face value, might otherwise seem like a somewhat dry topic. One challenge for you as you start, I encourage you to pay attention at the car numbers, because by the time we wrap up tonight, you will see at least one photo of each of the 30 cars, but interspersed throughout. In order to talk about the PCC era in Newark, it's important we do a brief history of the city subway itself. Why did it exist? Some of the challenges in creating it and at the time it was created. How the Newark subway had a need for then modern equipment after World War II. Obviously, the focus tonight, we're going to talk about the PCC era in Newark. Then itself, when the PCCs became obsolete, modern to one generation, obsolete to the next. Some of these remarkable vehicles went on to a third, and in a very few cases, a fourth career. We're going to have a little quiz, if you want to say, for some fun facts, and then we'll wrap up. Kristen already covered my background. Again, I'm really honored to be here. I enjoy these programs. I enjoy being able to present them, and especially I enjoy being able to hear what other presenters bring. I think this is a great educational resource, interesting way to spend your evening, and I really commend PTM for what they do with this, and Kristen in particular. And Kristen, thanks for the cool graphic and the collage that you put up for everyone to register to. So, as I mentioned, we're going to look about focus on the PCC era. We're going to talk about how through the cars, the city and the system changed, where some of these cars went. And as I mentioned, we're going to have a little fun at the end, something a little bit different. So in order to get to the PCC era in Newark, let's talk briefly about the city subway itself. The city subway was rather late in coming in the trolley era. It was originally designed to be what was called the Newark City Railway. It was a municipal project. The Morris Canal was still in existence and in use until just after World War I, at which time it was abandoned ditch through the city. The city intended to convert it to a high-speed right-of-way for public transit. The system was actually designed, the platform, so that they could eventually be raised for more of a rapid transit type operation like the New York subway. That never happened. But it was designed to be a way to get the streetcars from a number of lines throughout Newark a faster entrance to downtown. But the project began as the streetcar era started to wane. It started in 1929, which was ironic itself because that's the same year Public Service tested its first diesel-powered bus. A number of trolley lines, if you want to call them, throughout the state of New Jersey were converted to rubber tire vehicles by the time that the city subway itself opened. By 1952, the city subway, which originally had a number of routes going in it, there were ramps, there was a connection to the much shorter Cedar Street subway. By 1952, there was only one route left, number 7, the city subway, which was the route that existed throughout the PCC era. Public Service itself really had no plans to continue operation in the city subway. As they converted other rail routes, they lobbied hard to convert them to bus. They approached the city and proposed paving the subway. They thought the future would be in dual-mode diesel-electric trolley buses. They even purchased a demonstrator from General Motors. Rather innovative, if we look at it through the lens of today, where we see a lot of dual-mode vehicles. At that time, though, more an experiment. But the city itself was not on board. Number one, they own the subway. And Public Service may have wanted it paved, but the city was not willing to pave it for them. Also, they had an independent engineering consultant come in, look at what to do with the subway, and they actually recommended providing new equipment to maximize capacity and having passengers set up a free transfer system for bus passengers to connect to the subway. That was an agreement Public Service reached with the city when they converted all but the number 7 to bus in 1952. Much to the surprise of Public Service, the issuance of free transfer privileges at the end of March of 1952 literally swamped the city subway. Public Service offered transfers at a number of subway stations and also ran the buses downtown. The buses were clogged in traffic. They were carrying standing loads in the subway. On top of it, the rail vehicles then in use were obsolete. As I had the quote here, the Newark Evening News called them antiques, and they were carrying some of the heaviest loads they had carried since the wars. The system wanted to go to shorter headways. They had gotten to 2.5 minutes headways at rush hour, but the end of the line at North 6th Street, later Franklin Avenue, was a stub end terminal where each car had to proceed and change ends. They couldn't get any faster service with the existing terminal. It required a turning loop, and it also provided an opportunity to acquire some new rolling stock. So when we say Newark's antiques, what are we talking about? This is an example of a classic Public Service deck roof car. This particular Route 13 used briefly the Cedar Street subway. More importantly, this was taken the last week of service for that as a rail route. You can see the all-service vehicles are being touted. If you look on the front of the car, curb loading, faster service. The intent was, in Public Service's mind, that the future was going to be on rubber tires. This was your typical city subway car prior to the PCCs. This is on the 23 Central line, which was converted to bus operation in 1947. You can see there's all sorts of attempts to get passengers to ride. The car is lettered subway car, save time and parking. That both ads tout the city subway, but the conversions continued. And this is pretty much what the city subway looked like at the conclusion of the conventional car era. You can see here approaching Orange Street. Very industrial. Newark retained that industrial character throughout its existence. You can see clearly the former canal bed that the subway was built in. So an interesting situation, as Aaron Eyes explained in his presentation, developed that made these cars not necessarily new, but new to the citizens of Newark. Public Service officials started to look for somewhat modern secondhand equipment to operate the city subway. It is said they looked at the Atlantic City Brill liners. The cost at that time was rather substantial, about twice that quoted for the Twin Cities cars. There were also 25 cars available in Atlantic City. Newark's planned headway and planned schedule required 28 cars, which would obviously 25 wouldn't have done it. So in February 1953, after visiting Twin Cities, after inspecting the cars themselves, they purchased 30 cars for $350,000. Some of the cars at this point were barely 4 years old, and they were bought at less than half, roughly half the cost the Twin Cities had paid for the vehicles new. They were purchased as is. The Twin City cars that went to Shaker in Mexico City had varying degrees of work done to them in the Twin Cities. Public Service said, we'll do the refurbishment ourselves. After the contracts were signed, the first cars started arriving in August of 1953. So we'll take a brief look at the Twin Cities era. Again, Aaron Isaacs covered this in rather substantial and really interesting detail. This is car 325. It's believed to be on its maiden test run. This later would become Newark number 6. Minnesota Streetcar Museum graciously provided this photo. This is how the cars look new in the Twin Cities. They hadn't changed much by the time this photo was taken in the early 1950s. That's car 415 outside the Minnesota State Capitol. This would become Newark City Subway car 26. Another photo, again, compliments of our friends at the Minnesota Streetcar Museum. That's car 415 again, loaded on an Atlantic Coastline flat car, being towed by a Twin Cities line work car as it's getting staged for shipment to New Jersey. Cars arrived on railroad flat cars and were delivered to the Ferry Street shops of Public Service. You can see above car 320 the Public Service logo. The cars lined up. This would later become Newark car number 1. So the cars start to arrive one by one. You can see here we're starting to get a decent sized collection in the yards. Ferry Street had not done extensive trolley maintenance in a number of years, which led to some interesting circumstances when the cars were overhauled. So here's what the cars looked like upon completion of the, if you want to say the overhaul, if you want to call it that, some cleaning up, repainting. This is at Ferry Street. This is car 19 prior to delivery to the city subway. If you look closely at the photo, you'll notice a couple things. Number one, if you look under each wheel, there are no rails there anymore. The car's actually sitting up on small wood blocks. You can really see the contrast in the colors, even the wheels, which are red, and the trucks, which were gray. You'll see there is no wire above this track, and you'll see the car still has the rather large Twin City Lines trolley wheel. They used a unusually large trolley wheel. Newark used a smaller size until they went to trolley shoes. But here's what they looked like prior to delivery to the subway itself. The paint scheme is rather interesting in how it came about. As you saw in some of the earlier photos, the conventional cars were painted a yellow and a white with red trim. There was no other paint scheme in the later years for these cars. So for the PCCs, Public Service matched what it had on its fleet of buses. The buses had red hubs for the wheels, thus the exterior facing cheek plate on the PCC wheels were also painted red. It pretty much matched what the buses had. That's how the cars entered service and remained throughout much of their lives. They were numbered rather simply, 1 to 30. So as the cars were delivered and prepped for service, these ads started to appear on the older Newark City subway cars, inviting the public to know that they will be riding in them soon. Touts of the cars is quick, quiet, comfortable. Through the era of the early 1950s, it says our men will be trained to run them. Generational differences than today, obviously. The first car, car 16, is in this photo because it is actually the first car recorded to have been delivered to the city subway. It is not the first car to carry passengers, but 16 was probably available to make a quick ad. That's why it's in this photo. So one by one, the cars were delivered. Thanks to Harry Donahue, who was able some years back to acquire this slide that shows car 2 meandering its way through the streets. The cars were delivered to the Warren Street ramps adjacent to the subway portal in Newark. These ramps had been closed, but there was still track. They could unload the cars, roll them into the subway, put the pole up, and literally then move them under their own power to the then remaining, if you want to say, car house, if you want to call it that on the system, which was under Penn Station, a rather cramped facility which maintained cars until 2001. The PCC era began in Newark for the public on January 8th, 1954, with car 10. This is identical car 11. You could see freshly painted. This is at the new Franklin Avenue loop. A loop was constructed just prior to the cars arriving to enable the faster service, enable turning the PCCs. No need to change ends anymore like a conventional car. This car was one of several used on an ERA fan trip shortly before the older cars were retired. This is an original slide from that event. As is this, within a few weeks, February 4th was the last day the conventional cars carried passengers in the Newark City subway. You see definitely a contrast, old and new. Definitely it was time for a change in Newark. The older cars were 30 years or more older at that point. Some were approaching 30 years of age, some were World War I era. There was actually a lawsuit that involved the old cars to an extent. There was an incident with vandalism and vandals throwing rocks from Branchbrook Park. They got some negative publicity when a window broke and passengers were injured. It went back to commenting the old windows, the old cars. They didn't have the features of a modern car, such as safety glass. Another factor in the minds of the public, these cars had to go. As trolley fans, we may think of this, and enthusiasts, as a golden era, but to the public, the time had come. So everybody loves a new car. This was actually a quote NJ Transit used on some of its advertising when the replacements came for the PCCs. But the PCCs themselves introduced a modern era to Newark. The city subway at that time still had very heavy patronage. We had the 90-second headways, as mentioned. You had 28 cars in the rush hour. People came to see them. For example, this photo is it's a relatively low resolution, but was one of several that Ernie Moser, an operator from Philadelphia, took. He went up on July 4th weekend in 1954. He's a PCC operator, went to see the new cars in Newark. And just a classic black and white shot. You can see some of the ads at the time. Asbury Park's Boardwalk is still being touted as a destination that public service will take you to. We have an advertisement for Mighty Fine. We'll see some more ads on these cars later if you're from North Jersey, may bring back some fond memories. Here's car 3 approaching Orange Street shortly after it entered service. Again, attractive modern cars, faster service, quieter. It helped for a time the city subway to continue its heavy utilization of ridership, even though the system was down to just one line. At Franklin Avenue, as I mentioned, was the old North 6th Street, at least when it was opened. A turning loop was built. It was also set up as a bus transfer. There were different, if you want to say, berths at the platform where different buses could load and transfer you to the city subway. Not sure why the no parking sign was added. Not sure, short of driving up the curb or running down the tracks, how are you going to get there? But public service want to make sure you didn't drive on the platform. So the PCC cars quickly proved their worth for Newark. The city subway, it enabled the one-way running time to drop by 2 minutes. That may not sound like much, but when you think the entire one-way distance on the line was only 4.5 miles, that's pretty impressive considering, again, the length of the subway and headways were able to drop to 90 seconds at the rush hour. So the cars became part of the daily lives of the residents and the commuters in Newark, New Jersey. Here's car 6 in the late 1950s at Davenport Avenue Station. You can see there's some youth in Newark out apparently headed to the park to have a good time. The park alongside the car on the right of this photo, Branchbrook Park, interestingly enough, has more cherry blossoms than the tidal basin in Washington, D.C. There's car 6 again at either Park Avenue or Heller Parkway. You can see, pretty full car, passengers all the way in the back. You can also see the green glass in the standee windows. This was part of the way the cars were delivered to Minneapolis, and until the cars were overhauled by NJ Transit, that green glass remained in the upper sash or in the standee area. Car 14, nearly new. You see, some features if you're a diehard PCC enthusiast. The car still had the golden glow headlights at that time, the chromium plated windshield frames. Up on the roof, there's an antenna. That was part of an experiment at one time in Minneapolis to provide radio music from a radio station on the cars. I know Aaron Isaacs covers this in the Twin City Line story. The antennas remained right up to the end, but there was no radio music offered in the city subway. Car 17, nearly new. Shown here in the, if you want to call it the pocket track. At Franklin Avenue, there was a dead-end spur track basically built right into the street. The existing street was left in place when the loop was made and didn't come out many, many years later. Cars could be cut here if needed. This was also a way materials entered the subway. Most materials entering the car house for the city subway were loaded here on one of the work cars. I'll show a picture of that later. And then transferred into the subway. This even included traction motors. MG sets and other overhauled components were brought in. Also, track materials were stored here, and workers were brought to job sites on a car. And we have car 12 again alongside the park. You can see some vintage highway equipment on your left, some old trucks that are definitely long gone from the scene today. In car 11, shown here at Orange Street, in later years, this scene would change drastically. When an urban highway was built, there were some high-rise apartments built in this area, but 11 has just crossed over the Delaware-Lackawanna and Western Railroad. It ran in a trench underneath Orange Street Station. One platform, the outbound platform, was on the Lackawanna side of the intersection, and the inbound platform was closer to the subway portal. And see here, it's hard to read, but there's an ad for locally famous Ballantine beer on car 11. So the first change was rather subtle. It was said that the dark fleet numerals were hard to see. Particularly, there was still a tower in the Newark City subway used occasionally at rush hours. So a change was made to go to white numerals starting around 1960. I've noted here, if you look at the photo, I said not all at once. You'll notice the front of the car is white numerals. The side has dark numerals. Per the surviving maintenance records and per photographic evidence, after their initial paint job, the cars were often painted in sections. They weren't always painted all at the same time. You would see cars that might have one side with dark numerals, one side with light. Might have a white numeral in the front, a dark numeral in the rear, etc. The cars were also painted with brushes and rollers, in later years with foam brushes and rollers. There was no spray facilities to handle a car body in the city subway shops. So over the years, they were painted many, many times. For example, when the car 26 was stripped bare as part of its restoration for Baltimore Streetcar Museum, somewhere between 11 and 12 coats of paint were removed from the car. All the way down, the Twin Cities Line logo, at least in shadowy form, reemerged before the car was stripped bare and the car body was rebuilt. So we see car 24 here with the white numerals. It looks to be a hot day. Windows are wide open. This photo was taken by a young man named Harry Donahue, who had some time off. Loved trolley cars, went to Newark to ride and photograph the PCC cars. Harry's with us tonight. A number of the photos in here are his. Harry's also been a co-manager of the restoration project for Baltimore Streetcar Museum for car 26. But some years back, Harry was able to grab this shot for us at car 24. We see car 2. You can see here changes are starting to take place. The first of the high rises is completed at just outside Orange Street. The I-280 freeway hasn't been built in the background just across the intersection yet. Tungesol Electric, which made automotive lighting and other components, was still in business. Perhaps that's where the passengers are coming from after a shift at Tungesol. But the cars still show excellent maintenance, and you'll see that throughout. I'll talk some more about it when I talk about some of the features of the cars, some of the maintenance records. The city subway was not a museum, obviously. It was not maintained to be a museum. But generations of employees through the public service era, Transport New Jersey, and NJ Transit kept these cars going, more than just the bare minimum. Again, it was not a museum, but they kept these cars extremely well maintained up to the time the last was retired. We'll talk some more later about the fact that every car on the property at that point was able to go to storage under its own power. Again, it's just some strong, high quality maintenance in some primitive conditions. But at roughly 10 years of age, Car 2 still looks pretty good. Car 17 in the, most people think of a subway, although only a portion of the city subway is actually underground. 17 is here at the part of the loop where passengers were discharged. The way the operation was set up, inbound cars discharged on one end of the loop. You can see the signs to street. Outbound passengers, the car would then basically run around a loop under Penn Station, directly opposite this platform, but on the other side of the shop and several tracks over was the loading platform where outbound passengers would board. Franklin Avenue is just a great place for, from anywhere from 1954 up until 2001 to watch PCC cars. Cars came here, turned around, loaded up, and headed back out. At the rush hours, it was just a constant parade of vehicles. Here we see Car 18. Car 18 was one of the more, if you want to say, elusive cars on the property. 4 cars were destroyed through accidents, or at least destroyed to a condition where they were used for parts and later scrapped. 8, 18, 29, and 30. Photos of these cars are relatively uncommon, but here's 18 in better days in the late 1960s. Car 11, nose end view. Passenger looks like he's possibly counting change before heading inbound. And then Car 8, again, one of the more elusive cars on the property. Doors closed. They would drop off at this end of the platform, close the doors, and then if there was a layover, if there was, it was literally a minute or two in most cases, the cars would just, and in rush hours even less, the cars would then pull forward on the platform, load inbound passengers, and proceed. Things started to change in a lot of urban cities, and Newark was no exception by the late 1960s. One of the challenges with the city subway was the fact that other than underground and at Orange Street, which was surface crossing, and at the very end of the line at Franklin Avenue, it pretty much ran in a cut, and it was entirely grade separated other than Orange Street. However, this presented a challenge with vandals who would drop everything from rocks to cinder blocks to construction debris off of overpasses. The maintenance records for these cars include many instances, it's almost a surprising number, of windshields being taken out by projectiles or dropped debris. The roofs of the cars, as cars that have been stripped down, a lot of dents from the same circumstance. So in order to reduce the costs of windshield replacement and provide some safety for the operators, starting in the late 1960s, that heavy mesh screen, it's actually not like a window screen, it's a heavy gauge wire, basically, screen with steel supports, was added to the front of the cars. Certainly many thought it damaged the aesthetics of the cars, but at the same time, safety was paramount. And the cars carried these up until the very end, except for the last few months with Car 6, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But even by this late date, things had changed for some of the Jersey Shore towns, the fortunes of places like Asbury Park, but public service is still advertising its bus service there. Some more change came with the continuing development of the interstate highway system. I-280 was built right through a good part of the heart of Newark. You can see here at Orange Street, 280 is under construction here. Photos taken roughly 1968 in that era. You can see Car 26 clearly showing its windshield screen. So there's more trouble ahead than just falling rocks and projectiles. In common with public transit throughout the United States, the entire public service system, bus and rail, ridership declined starting in the late 1950s and the early 1960s to the point where it was no longer, the fare box was no longer covering operating costs. The city subway itself, as I mentioned earlier, was owned by the city of Newark, and it was a 30-year lease to public service. The lease started in 1935. So thus, 35 years later, in 1970, it's due to expire. It may have been a ploy on the part of public service to get subsidy support for running its system. Public service announced it didn't intend to renew its lease of the city subway upon its expiration. If it was a threat or a ploy, it worked because the state of New Jersey started to formalize and legalize the subsidy for public service. That ensured a future of the city subway. But ridership continued to decline to the point where only 16 cars were needed to meet the rush hour by the early 1970s. Still a lot of cars when you think about it. You know, if the line's 4.5 miles long and you have 8 cars in each direction, it's a car every half a mile. It's still not too bad, but 12 cars less, obviously, than the peak. This is also, you know, some of the damaged cars at this point. 29 was the first in 1966 after derailment of the subway. Some of the cars, you know, the need to repair them was not there. But the rest of the cars, the maintenance was still kept to a very high standard. To further stem losses, the Public Service Coordinated Transport changed its transportation business to what was called TNJ, or Transporting New Jersey, in 1971, largely an effort to distance the financially troubled transit operations from the more profitable PSE&G, or Public Service Electric and Gas, which still exists. Yes, the Public Utility Holding Company Act of the Depression mandated that utilities divest themselves of non-utility operations. There was still a, if you want to say, corporate connection between the two operations in public service. The TNJ was an effort to separate it, would later facilitate creation of a public agency. Not much changed. The public service logos themselves started to disappear by the new TNJ logos. For some reason, the paint scheme changed very slightly, with a blue being applied to the lower belt rail, or lower rub rail, excuse me, to match the belt rail, something that wasn't done in public service days. So this is car 7 at the start of the public service era. The TNJ logo hasn't been applied yet, but it's got the blue lower stripe. It's here at Franklin Avenue, and you can see the changes. The cobblestone paving we saw earlier is gone. This is mostly a lay-down yard now. Cars would still lay over here, whether it be for fan trips, whether it be to bring employees out to a work site, etc. Moving on a little further, in the early 1970s, you can see I-280 is brand new and opened. The cars really haven't changed. Lower belt rail, or excuse me, lower rub rail is blue. You can see the TNJ logo. Even an ad for the Yellow Pages. Probably many of us can remember that. That was, you know, came every year, whether you were in Pennsylvania or New Jersey with New Jersey Bell. You know, how else would you look up a phone number without the Yellow Pages? Obviously today, they're pretty much not useful for anything but a doorstop, but hey, it was important enough to be advertised in the 1970s on a PCC car. Another shot at Orange Street, this case, cars 13 and 17 passing. It was not uncommon to find the cars passing in Orange Street by virtue of the fact that cars did wait for the traffic light here. It's one place they were governed by the traffic signal. Elsewhere on the system, they were governed by wayside signals. Much like the post office, through rain, through snow, through dark of night, the cars continued on. Here's car 3. Car 3 would actually be leaving in the 1970s, which we'll talk about a little more in a moment. But here it is in TNJ days on a very cold and dark day at approaching Davenport Avenue. I admire the photographer for braving the storm to get this shot. So starting in 1975, TNJ will start to repaint the cars in its own color scheme, perhaps inspired by the bicentennial, or red, white, and blue. At this point, the active fleet was down to 26 cars. As I mentioned, 4 had been retired at this point. You can see here car 11 and a sister car, and otherwise a sea of gray of cars stored between rush hour operations at Penn Station. Here's car 9 modeling the TNJ colors. That sign to the left, there are photos of it from when the city subway opened with various messages on it. How many minutes to downtown, what the fare was. At this point, it was 70 cents. It finally came down when the new Orange Street station was built for the LRVs. But that sign, it was painted and lettered many times. It was there, throughout the PCC era and well before that. You can see Newark's industrial era is starting to wane. The former factory, common in a lot of photos, has become a self-storage at this point. Car 28 at, I believe it's Park Avenue, here modeling the TNJ colors. They're rather striking, rather bright, obviously. Also note the exact change only on the dash of the car. The city subway was the last rail operation in the United States to go to an exact fare payment system. It didn't go to that until roughly the mid-1970s. Car 4 modeling the TNJ colors on the S-curve approaching Davenport Avenue. Again, this Branchbrook Park would be on the left of the photo. Again, all sorts of weather. Here's car 16 leaving Franklin Avenue, approaching Heller Parkway. This car itself in later years would become a work car of sorts. In the NJ Transit era, a number of the seats were removed, and it was set up that way to pick up garbage. It was also had a few seats in it so that employees could get to work sites, that they could carry small tools, etc. Although, interestingly enough, materials were kept on hand such that if the car was ever needed for passenger service in a short period of time, it could be returned to that. But here it is still in passenger days in a decent-sized snowstorm. Car 27 at the ever-popular Orange Street crossing. But this would be one of the last photos taken of 27 in Newark. Cars 3 and 27, circa 1977, were sold to Greater Cleveland RTA for use on the Shaker Heights Rapid Transit, which we'll see in a moment. Shaker Heights had a serious accident in the 1970s that destroyed 2 of their former Twin City Lines cars. The NTSB actually investigated the accident. Short of cars in need of equipment, they approached Newark. Newark sold them cars 3 and 27. There are various theories for this. One is they were the 2 worst performing cars. Unfortunately, the maintenance records for these 2 cars that would have helped explain why they were sold were sent to Cleveland with the cars and were later lost and have yet to be found. So all we can go off is anecdotally, they were felt to be the 2 cars least desirable, so that's what were sold, but we're still looking for the evidence. But cars 3 and 27 did go to Cleveland. Initially, they ran in their New Jersey colors with RTA logos. Later were repainted as 27 is seen here. I believe it's Shaker Square. That's one of their, the car 81, one of the Pullman cars built specifically for the line. These cars lasted. 3 and 27 actually last till the end of PCC service in Cleveland. That was their 3rd transit use. Here's car 3 after it was repainted, running in Cleveland. Remarkably, these cars went on to a 4th home, where car 3 still runs. This is car 3 restored, extensively restored, back as Twin City Lines 322 by what's now the Minnesota Streetcar Museum. This car really sets the standard for Newark car restorations. Over a 10-year period, it was stripped bare. Aaron Isaacs tells a great story about it in his presentation. You can look more on the Minnesota Streetcar Museum website. But just a fantastic job. The car is completely reconstructed. And today, it's in the shop for some work, but today is in operation in Minneapolis, will soon be released again, and just a beautiful car. A lot of the work on the Car 26 we'll talk briefly about later. The extent of the work was inspired by what Minneapolis did with, well, what I'll still call Newark 3. Newark 27 also found a home. It was acquired in title by the Minnesota Streetcar Museum. They elected to focus on just one car and later sold this car to Shoreline Trolley Museum, where it is here. You can see it's being prepped and painted and cleaned up for display. But 3 and 27 departed, but the story in Newark continued on. The losses on transit operations really didn't change under TNJ ownership. There was still a call for public ownership if public transit in New Jersey was to continue on. So the New Jersey Transit Corporation, the formal name, or NJ Transit as many call it, or NJT, was created by the state legislature in 1979 and assumed control of the TNJ in 1980. At that point, they planned for a revitalization of the city subway. Originally, the plan was to replace the rolling stock. The Urban Mass Transit Administration had funded the design of the standard light rail vehicle, which many people commonly call the Boeing LRV. We know how that story went. When part of the, if you want to say, focused on what was going on at UMTA with the new car design, TNJ and later NJ Transit sought to use available funding to overhaul the city subway infrastructure itself. By this point, the rails were tired. There were a lot of weeds. Stations were getting in a pretty poor state of repair. The line needed some drainage work. So instead of purchasing new vehicles, the infrastructure of the city subway was rebuilt over a period of several years, and the PCC cars were given a light overhaul. This was time to be completed or the work was to be completed, the infrastructure work and the first two cars, to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the city subway in 1985. Towards that end, Car 26 was the first overhauled car, and it broke a ceremonial banner at Franklin Avenue to commemorate 50 years of the city subway and looking forward. So you can see here when NJ Transit took over, the TNJ logos disappeared. The cars, until they're overhauled, really didn't change much. We're back here again at Davenport Avenue. You can see the extent of the work. New rail has already been laid. The existing platforms are completely demolished. The pedestrian overpass, which dated from the opening of the city subway, was repaired and made structurally sound again. Although in the LRV era, this finally disappeared. It was replaced by a grade crossing. Here's Car 21. This is on the dedication day for the city subway. It was not yet overhauled. It has a little gold logo on the left of the photo on the dash. You can't really read it in this photo, but what it says is 50th anniversary of the subway itself. The cars, of course, are not yet 50. You can see the extent of the rebuilt trackage, too. But until overhaul, the older cars soldiered on as they were. There's 6 in the subway after a rather young passenger had departed. As mentioned, Car 26 was the first overhauled car. The reasons for that are somewhat unknown. It's not clear in the maintenance records necessarily why. Perhaps it was a matter of timing in the shop. It's shown here running back inbound after the conclusion of the ceremony at the turning loop at Franklin Avenue. To give you an idea of the overhaul done, the interiors were completely stripped. New floors were installed, including wood where it needed to go was replaced. This was not the first time the floors were done, but it gave a good opportunity to do that again. The older step wells, many of the steps had been replaced over the years, were completely replaced with new step wells. You'll see an operator's seat that looks rather different from what PCC cars typically carried. In an effort to give some more comfort to the operators, the cars were fitted with bus seats that offered a little more padding than were U.S. Seating Company seats. Just simply to give a little more, they had more adjustments, armrests, a little more to the operators. Along with the bodywork, the cars were completely repainted inside and out. The trucks were overhauled, basically in kind, nothing really elaborate, but motors overhauled, bearings overhauled, etc. The thought was a light overhaul to get the car some additional years of use. So one by one, each car was overhauled. The second car was car 28. But the older cars lingered on a while. Here's 16 again, in the snow again. It's approaching Franklin Avenue outbound, while 23 had just departed inbound. The cars, they wore the NJ Transit colors as well as any of their modern buses. There seemed to be very mixed opinions from the enthusiasts, whether or not they liked the paint scheme or not. Some loved it, some hated it. For the riders, were most important, overhauled cars, new upholstery inside that was extreme, well, not original type, was what was used in their motor coaches, provided, a nice, pleasant, welcoming environment, a brighter interior, and most importantly, the cars mechanically were a little better off to see them through the end of service. And they went this way into the 1990s. Again, maintenance was always kept high. You look at car 19 here. This car was not fresh from overhaul at this point. It had been in use for several years, but it's pretty hard to find any rust, any damage. Certainly, after decades of use, the cars had dings, dents, scrapes. Some were filled, some weren't. But you can see here the level of maintenance, and it wasn't just skin deep. The mechanical, electrical maintenance of these cars, again, dated equipment, using traditional methods in a very small shop, but was done to a very high level. Some of the cars later lost their chrome windshields when new safety glass was installed. Some had lost them earlier, some lost them later. Here's 22. Towards the end of service, this is in the mid-1990s at Franklin Avenue. You can see also, I'll go back, when the city subway was rebuilt, Franklin Avenue, a sharper curve was added, and the unloading and then loading track, where the cars headed inbound, was moved closer to that former, if you want to call it that pocket track or that spur, and the older paving was removed by and large. There was a little piece of it left, but you can see how this was reconfigured. It provided more space for passengers to disembark from the bus and transfer to the PCC or vice versa. So I mentioned throughout, the shop really did some remarkable work. No, this is not an attempt just to get a close-up shop. I'm standing towards the back wall where the workbench was in the shop, looking out. This is where everything from partial rewirings to detrucking to removal of traction motors was done. A small but very dedicated, very talented crew working in what's one step above a confined space. Kept at that time the nation's largest fleet of PCC cars in operation. But the end was coming for the PCCs. The new Hudson Bergen light rail line was planned as a new start light rail line under an interesting model, design, build, operate, maintain model. That's a whole separate topic unto itself. But with the coming of that line, it led to interest in looking at other modernizations that could be done and extensions eventually to the city subway. There were two eventual route extensions post-PCC era. The design of the Hudson Bergen cars would meet the operational requirements of the city subway, other than the loop at Franklin Avenue, which was a little too tight. The loop at Penn Station was not. And 16 cars were added to the Hudson Bergen line's order for use in a, once again, modernized city subway. So that required some infrastructure modifications. The city subway, some of the platforms were modified slightly. The entire system was restrung with new overhead wire, new poles for pantograph operation. But this was done sequentially. Rather than shut the line down to modernize it, a number of features in the new cars were tested in the PCCs. For example, pantographs. The PCCs were refitted with pantographs, and some may have asked why were the pantographs removed at the end of service? Why did none of them go to museums or new homes with pantographs? That's because they were intended to be spares, and every one of them was removed. They were not basically given away when the cars were disposed of. Several new features were tested. Car 22 was used to test the new floors to be used in the LRVs. It was also the car that got interior cameras to see how cameras would work before the new cars were delivered. The PCCs sort of became test beds for a couple features, which helped reduce some of the technological leap found in the new cars. So by the late 1990s, work had started. You can see here, car 17 is at the loop while a crew is out preparing caissons for the new terminal, which will replace Franklin Avenue. Franklin Avenue and Heller Parkway, which was just out of view to the right, were combined into one new station called Branchbrook Park, a three-track terminal that would allow cars eventually going to the end of the line in Bloomfield. You could cut cars here instead after the LRVs came. Here's 21 at Orange Street. It has the pantograph added, but it's still using the pole. The aliens have landed. It's a little bit of humor for a regular rider, a very close friend of mine, and he was heavily involved with the North Jersey Electric Railway Historical Society. Bill Keir, not only was an enthusiast, he rode the city subway cars to work every day at Rutgers, Newark. I remember when the first car had its pantograph added, he sent a message to a number of his friends and enthusiasts that the aliens have landed. So the aliens landed on car 21, but they're still using the pole. You can see here at this point, the old loop is still in place, but service has to be maintained. So as the new platform's constructed, it was restrung for pantograph one. Also, the wire was restrung. Here's 14 running on the pantograph. Here's car 1 on a fan trip. You can see some of the station improvements. The tactile strips were modified at the end of the platforms, new signage. Like I said, Heller Parkway and Franklin Avenue were combined. A lot of other infrastructure improvements. Pantographs or not, though, the PCC soldiered on. Major works I mentioned at many locations. Orange Street was one of the most dramatic changes. What had been side platforms became temporary until a new center island platform was constructed, but it can only be used when the LRVs started, simply because it would require boarding on the left side, and none of the PCCs had left side boarding. So temporary platforms were constructed while the new permanent structure was built and used until the end. Here's car 6 seen later as the new Orange Street station is starting to really take shape at this point. And we're getting closer to completion here. This is the new terminal at Branchbrook Park, formerly Franklin Avenue. The cars soldiered on. This is a shot of car 9 approaching Orange Street. This is one of the few scenes you can see the new platform is basically done. This was literally a matter of weeks before PCC service ended. It's one of the few photos I've seen where you can actually see the different levels of transportation, if you want to say at this stop. You have Orange Street at grade. You have I-280 above, and you can see the cut that the former Erie Lackawanna, originally Delaware Lackawanna and Western, operated in. Early in 2001, the first LRV began testing. Now, there was never mixed service with the PCCs and the LRVs, but in order to be ready, at least theoretically ready for opening day, the first LRV was tested while the PCC cars were still in regular service. You see the wayside signals are still installed. They will be removed at the end of PCC operation. But the end was coming at this point. The PCC fleet was continued to be maintained to a very high level. The opening of the new city subway, if they called it that again, was delayed by several months, but the PCC cars rolled ahead. For example, that maintenance was still kept high. If you look back at the records, for example, car 6, 2 weeks before it was retired, had new brushes put in its traction motor because, well, they need to keep going. There was a rather elaborate ceremony. NJ Transit really did a superb job of commemorating the end of this era in Newark. There were speeches, there were vendors, balloons, bands, rather extensive send-off for the cars, which had really become part of the city. But the final operation ended about 10 o'clock that night. Car 14 happened to be in line. Car 6 was the last car, but car 14 carried some final dignitaries and made the very last trip. The cars also, these two final cars, deadheaded to storage to the new shop facility in Bloomfield. And throughout the day, car after car was moved out there. This was their one and only trip on the extension of the city subway. The subway was then closed for the weekend. The loop at Franklin Avenue was removed. And then Monday, August 27th, new service started. It did not go well. They saw a lot of problems with the timing, the headways, getting the cars to run on the intended schedule. It took several months, and there was significant ridership challenges and rider frustrations when the new cars came. But the bugs were worked out. Within a few years, the Newark City subway was where it should be schedule-wise, and then a few years after that, it was renamed the Newark Light Rail, which is known to this day. Along with the extension to Bloomfield, there's also an extension out to Atlantic Avenue using a piece of the old Cedar Street subway, but those operations commenced after the PCC era had ended. So to celebrate the end, car 6 was selected to be the commemorative car, which was rather ironic because it had been in an accident. It had rear-ended car 2 a few months earlier, was repainted in roughly March in NJ Transit colors, and by the end of April was repainted again in the commemorative public service colors. You can see here the paint's done, the decal is not. This is prior to it being released for service. As I mentioned, the cars one by one start to make their way to the new facility for dead storage. If it looks like there is a little bit of traffic chaos here, there is, as the cars crossed the crossing and then went out the new line. You see the parade of cars on their way. 3 cars in this scene are climbing the grade to meet the former Erie Railroad, the branch that was later used for the subway extension or the light rail extension. For those who know Bob Hooper from North Jersey Electric Railway Historical Society, he just happened to candidly be in this photo. But the era ended after 47 years. Time had come for a new generation of equipment, and the PCCs went off into storage. For that time, some plans had never materialized, which we're going to talk about as we start to wrap up. Before we do that, what was a day in the life of a Newark PCC like? What did these cars go through? What was service like? Thankfully, going back to public service days, meticulous records were kept on each car, even the work cars, that provided a date, in some cases the badge number of the employee who performed heavy maintenance, things that were more than just routine. We use car 26 as an example. I had its data handy when I put this together, and it helps, gives a snapshot of what the public doesn't often see about how do you keep a car going. So you can see I've listed a number of things here. Year after it was in service, the trolley roof boards, my guess is they were the same ones that came from Minneapolis were replaced. There were a number of minor accidents for all the cars. You see that in 59. In 1964, the Golden Glow headlight disappeared to a sealed beam. There were some front end repairs done. Fast forwarding a little bit, when 26 was completely rebuilt car body wise, there were evidence of multiple repairs in the front. In fact, a continuous dash was found to be in 3 pieces, and that all had to be cut out and replaced. That's not a reflection on the shop. I mean, it's one thing to restore a car, it's another to make it safe so it can be out of the shop and carrying people as soon as possible. Floor had to be replaced at times, steps, doors. A number of the cars were substantially rewired, some more than others. Car 26, just for example, is one of the cars that had nearly all of its high voltage wiring replaced late in its life. We see another accident late in its life, car body repairs, pantograph. And then again, to speak to the maintenance, 6 weeks before the car was retired, a overhauled motor generator was installed. So the cars are retired. And to quote the former NJ Trans executive director at that time, he described them at the farewell ceremony as like a litter of puppies that you don't want to send to new homes, but you need to do something with. So there were plans to have two different historic operations in the state of New Jersey, one a museum, one would be a light rail line using PCC cars to Elizabeth, New Jersey. None of these plans happened. The cars continued to sit. Finally, San Francisco Municipal Railway was offered to purchase 11 of the cars. They were completely rebuilt. First, they were painted and then completely rebuilt. And they're still in use on the F-Line Heritage operation, which we'll talk about in a moment. Remaining cars sat primarily until 2011. 3 cars went to museums at that time. Car 5 went to Seashore. Car 6 went to Rock Hill Trolley Museum. Car 10 was placed in storage elsewhere and eventually returned to public transit operation in San Diego. The last of the cars departed NJ Transit property in 2013, other than one, which was later kept and is now stored at a facility in North Jersey, somewhat displayed but not publicly. But it took about 13 years to finally send the cars to new homes. San Francisco was the first really new career for the cars that made it to the end. Ironically enough, the last one to run in Newark and carry passengers was the first one to go to San Francisco, car 14, seen here in its new home. 14 would later be repainted and overhauled and perhaps fittingly became the Newark tribute car. Now car 1070, seen here at the ferry terminal, on its third career of carrying passengers. Car 1074 was former 23, became the Minneapolis tribute car. The only place that I can think of in the world where a Minneapolis car runs next to a Newark car in both paint schemes. This photo was taken in 2019. You can see it's evening. There's a heavy load. This was a business trip I had to go to work in San Francisco, where perhaps conveniently I had to ride the F line to work every day, which was no problem. A number of the cars were painted in tributes to other cities. This car, of course, was painted for Detroit and became Muni Car 1079. And eventually, 2 Newark cars were painted for San Diego, but both were not in San Francisco, which we'll talk about in a few moments. But this is San Francisco's San Diego car, made out of a Newark car, seen here at dawn, approaching Pier 39. For the cars that didn't go to San Francisco, 10 years outside started to take a toll. Some of the cars were pretty much left as as you see it here, unprotected. Some others were shrink wrapped, sort of cocooned, and actually hauled by truck up to Jersey City or Communipaw at the Hudson Bergen Light Rail shops. Mixed thoughts on that, having been involved with several of the cars that were cocooned. It was a great intent, but the problem was it tended to trap moisture inside. Cars that sat outside while the weather still took a toll. It was really a mixed bag. But you can see our car 6, shortly before it went to a home and a museum, was the last one painted. The outdoor storage was starting to take a toll by this time. So in April 2011, as I mentioned, the first cars started to depart from museums. Car 5 left first, went to Seashore. Car 6 was loaded next. You can see here it was shoved by an LRV, then towed by a skid loader onto Silk Road's trailer. Harry Donahue and I assisted with the loading. Harry took that shot of my backside as I'm watching them start to move the car. Car 6 was also the first one to return of the group that made it to the end. I'm not counting cars 3 and 27, but the cars that last to the end to return to service in a museum. The Rock Hill crew at that time took it as a challenge to see if the car could be not only operated, but cosmetically restored to commemorate 10 years since the end of PCC service in Newark. 34 days after it arrived, the car ran. It was a pretty intense schedule to get to that point. The car didn't need much, but it had sat for 10 years. There was everything needed cleaned, inspected, lubricated, Spring was broken in a contactor, things like that. And then the body was cleaned, primed, prepped, some body filler, and then completely repainted. It was completed just in time. There was still some fresh paint the next morning. This was the night before its dedication ceremony. You can see here the interior thoroughly cleaned and almost entirely repainted, as well as the exterior. Joel Salomon took this photo. Joel is and still is the president of Rock Hill Trolley Museum. Took this photo with a 1949 Plymouth. This photo would actually later be on the cover of the magazine of the Plymouth Owners Club. You can see the effort done to make car 6 presentable. At the dedication ceremony, taking a cue from the 50th anniversary of the city subway, it ran through a ceremonial banner. The banner's on the ground here. It's already been broken, but you can see each of the logos that the car wore were mounted on the banner. And then on the right, there's Harry Donahue again on the far left in the right photo. There's Bill Monahan, known to many, by the right side of the car, and myself in the center. Car 6 remains at Rock Hill Trolley Museum. It's not used regularly. It's used occasionally, mostly for special events. Rock Hill's operating protocols, they don't really run the PCCs very much. They're primarily a special event or special circumstance type of car. The car does continue to run well. It was well maintained for a number of years. Just hasn't run much recently. But this was a somewhat rare photo because one PCC out at Rock Hill is kind of rare. Both are really an unusual circumstance. But this was a private event where a group chartered the museum basically to charter the 2 PCCs. Car 2743 on the left from Philadelphia. You can see how much narrower it is than a former Twin City Lines car. 2743 was the subject, as was 6. I'm not going to go extensively into restoration because both of these cars were talked about in a previous Trolleyology where we talked about lessons learned from PCC car restorations. 2743 is an absolute gem, but I can put that in the link. I can put that link in the chat later. If you're interested in what goes into restoring a PCC, I invite you to look at that presentation. Certainly cars found in homes at other museums. Some are in storage. Car 7 is actually displayed inside of the New York Museum of Transportation near Rochester in its building in its NJ Transit colors. In 2014, car 26 went to the Baltimore Streetcar Museum. Baltimore, ironically enough, and Rock Hill had each written letters to NJ Transit requesting a car. After they were retired, both were declined the first time. It's funny how things happen. Both got one the second time. 26 was sent to Baltimore with the intent to make it pretty much an everyday car, like the Philadelphia PCC in the background, car 2168. The wide body also makes an ideal car to be used with a platform-based wheelchair lift. It requires no permanent modifications to the car, no changes to its historical structure. It's been a 10-year project at Baltimore. Here you can see it's being retrucked. Baltimore is a broad gauge operation. This is after it arrived, before the car was moved inside. It started to be cleaned up. Again, the cocoon, saved some damage, but also trapped some moisture. Shortly after it arrived, before Baltimore had new security systems, the car was graffitied. However, one of our younger members took it upon himself to remove the graffiti almost instantly. You want to encourage your younger members. This individual has since continued to grow, led special projects, and is now one of our regular operators. But he got his start because he couldn't stand to see that car get vandalized. Over time, the car was brought back to running condition. It was modified substantially. Again, in the presentation on PCC car restorations, we talk more about that. It had some major control changes, some major work done to enable it to be used with a set of former Philadelphia trucks and some other components. It was seen here in 2018 on one of the first test runs. It looks rough, but the goal was to make it run before it was made to look pretty. Then the fall of 2018, there were some more bugs. They were worked out, and ironically enough, there was a special event that day. Even more ironic, it was the 50th anniversary of the last PCC car, excuse me, 55th anniversary of the last PCC car operation in the city of Baltimore. Here's the group that by and large made it possible. The car was then sent off-site for a 5-year restoration. The car body was stripped bare, completely rebuilt, every inch of rust removed. The roof alone had several thousand hours of work. It was then returned from the contractor's site back to the museum earlier this year. You can see here it's on its way back to Baltimore. And methodically, step by step, the car has continued to move along in its restoration. An intent was to have it completed in 2024. I think it's going to be pushed to 2025. But you can see the quality of the work. You can see the progress being made. Harry has co-managed this project together with me. And you can see Harry's reaction when the golden glow headlight and the wings were restored back to the front of the car. Again, there's a number of updates about this on Baltimore Streetcar social media, its newsletter, and as well as the project itself is covered extensively in a separate Trolleyology. But you have a PCC, and PCC guys will travel. This is up at Brantford with car 25. Although he's very camera shy, I will call out Bill Wall on the far left of the group. Bill is largely the reason why these cars all found homes. He was friends with City Subway employees for a number of years and made it his personal commitment to see that the cars found homes. The group that started working on 6 later moved on to work on car 26. We're given a nickname by an individual who just wasn't a PCC fan, called them those PCC guys. Well, the name stuck. We even all had shirts made that said PCC guys. But more importantly than that, I've tried to help other museums with PCC cars that have problems solve their challenges. This group and members thereof spent several trips to Brantford to make 25 operational. Still has a lot of work left. It has been cleaned up some more. But as a thank you to Bill Wall for everything he did for different museums, the same group has provided technical support and assistance, whether it be phone calls, technical materials, Newark cars, other cars, to museums from coast to coast, most recently in Iowa. But here's car 25 at Brantford, one of its test runs after we got it operational again. Classic shot on the trestle. Bill Monahan took a break from working, couldn't help himself but take this photo. The car looks rough, but it was brought back to running condition, and the future looks bright for this car. So as we wrap up, let's have a little bit of fun. Let's talk about some Q&A and a little quiz. How well do you know your Newark cars? And this is not going to be overly technical. So let's start with the first one. Newark's PCC cars have been in Hoboken, New Jersey. True or false? That's true, but not under their own power. For a number of years, a Newark PCC car was hauled by truck to the Hoboken Festival outside Hoboken Terminal. Here in the mid-1990s, there's car 4. It's taken out of service, ran up on the trailer, brought over, displayed. People got to walk through it, and returned to Newark. At the very least, cars 4, 6, and 10, I know have made appearances there. Again, did they run under their own power? No. But a PCC car has been in Hoboken. Now, the late Jerry Lewis owned a Newark PCC car. This may sound strange, but a few years back, about 10 years ago on April 1st, a message was posted to different enthusiast sites that said Jerry Lewis had acquired a, quote, missing Newark PCC car. It was rather well worded and written. It spread around like wildfire. I got several phone calls that day asking me if this was true. Okay, I did not create it. I let it roll a little bit, to the point where people were finding aerial photos of his estate saying, here's where the car was stored. But that is false. Obviously, every Newark PCC car has been accounted for. Some are not publicly displayed. Some, their current owners, wish to maintain privacy, and that's fine. But Jerry Lewis, and who is now passed on in his estate, does not own a Newark car. But be careful on April 1st, because for several years this rumor went around, and some people who claim a lot of expertise on this fell for this one. But no, Jerry Lewis did not own a Newark PCC car. And I did not start that rumor. Now, last trivia question. The Newark PCC car was traded for 2 light rail vehicles. Sounds bizarre, but that is true. Here's why. This is taken directly, it's publicly available public information from the minutes of the meeting of the board of directors of the San Diego Metropolitan Transit System in September of 2013. The board agreed that they would send both the Rock Hill Trolley Museum and the Western Railway Museum a U2 light rail vehicle. The exchange of 2 surplus U2 light rail vehicles for 1 PCC car, former New Jersey Transit number 10. This is a fact. That is how the first 2 U2 cars in San Diego were preserved. Car number 10 had changed hands. It was the San Diego Vintage Trolley operation was looking for another car they could use on their Silver Line service, deliver something that would take less work than the first car they restored. Fates intervened. The individual was involved in the transaction, loved the U2 cars, had done work for MTS for them, thought because of San Diego's historical significance as the first New Start light rail system, that one of their cars should be preserved both on the West Coast as well as the East Coast because it was so significant to our nation's public transportation history. That's how these cars were saved, thanks to, for the first 2. Others went to additional cars, went to other museums, but this is how the first 2 left. And the individual picked a museum on the West Coast, a museum on the East Coast. He knew individuals at, and the rest was history. But again, that story is true. Here's car 10. Upon its arrival in San Diego, you could see San Diego's car 529. It's a former St. Louis Public Service car that spent some time in San Francisco. And there is, I believe it's U2 1018, which will soon be loaded for its trip to Western Railway Museum after number 10 is unloaded on a different trailer. But when 10 arrived, the 2 LRVs left. San Diego did an absolutely magnificent job restoring this car. It needed less work than the former St. Louis Public Service car. It still needed a lot of work. This was a photo taken in the wee hours of the morning during pre-revenue service testing after the car body had been restored. It had a number of updates, some electrical work, some mechanical work, but just an absolutely fabulous job. If you go to San Diego, you look on their website when their Silver Line historic trolley service is running. They have 3 cars available for service: 529, former St. Louis Public Service car; 530, Newark number 10, or 1001, which was their very first LRV. The 530 is a popular car for service. You can see here it's displayed for the American Public Transportation Association's 2022 Rail Conference. I'm very proud of this car. See a back end view. The trolley pole is no longer functional, but it was retained. San Diego did an exceptional job of ensuring the car could be sustained in a modern transit operating environment, but a nod to its historical features. There were some compromises. The doors are surplus Siemens LRV stock that were cut down simply because they have plenty of them. But the work was simply exceptional. The car performs extremely well. You can see the operators area and gang switch pretty much as it was in Newark, just some minor upgrades, cleaned up, painted. And the right inside, the car carries a tribute to Ed Lindstrom. Ed is now retired from San Diego. He was a Navy veteran in the Seabees, who then spent roughly 30 years in San Diego. He personally spearheaded the restoration effort on these cars. I personally found him just to be a pleasure to work with. Credit is his for the work done. This car is absolutely beautiful, and amazingly enough, it's also at another home running in service. We'll wrap up with a couple eccentricities of the Newark City subway, if you want to call it that. An interesting fact: in the PCC era, throughout it, and even a little beyond, the work car fleet was actually older than the PCC cars. Car 2683, a conventional car, was cut down into what you see here, was used to haul material. Among the material it carried, you look in these photos, are buckets of salt for platforms. Newark City subway cars didn't necessarily rot from the bottom up. Other than Orange Street, they didn't run in any streets in New Jersey. The passengers tracked salt in on their feet and tended to rust the cars from the inside out. Safety is important. You need to have a safe place to board and exit the car. You can see here it's carrying buckets of salt. This car also carried everything from PCC traction motors to overhaul and back. It was basically a pickup truck with a trolley pole. Newark also had a sweeper for many years. This was the later sweeper. It had two single truck sweepers that dated from public service days. They were destroyed in a fire set by vandals in the 1970s. They then acquired this car from Toronto. It formerly had been on 3rd Avenue in New York, and then prior to that was in Trenton. So over its life, it took the long way to get from Trenton to Newark. This car is in storage now. It's a little worse for wear, but it still exists. But it was used into the early 2000s. And here's 5223 again, with what appears to be a load of rebuilt traction motors. City Subway also had operational. There were other cars. There was a plow stored dead in the subway for many years. They also had a tower car, line car, which was formerly a box motor used on the Newark Trenton Fast Line. And finally, some enthusiasts in 1954 felt it was important to document something hardly ever seen. Where was the back of the Franklin Avenue Loop? So while not necessarily a spectacular photo, if you ever wondered what the back of the loop looked like at Franklin Avenue, car 30 is passed, and this was the gate that allowed access for material and equipment deliveries. So as we wrap up, some individuals certainly deserve some particular thanks. Harry Donahue, as I mentioned throughout, Harry is just an absolute friend to preservation, one of the co-founders of the Friends of Philadelphia Trolleys. Harry, along with the work with FPT as an operator of the Baltimore Streetcar Museum, he's been involved with a number of projects, a generous supporter of so many projects. He's been co-manager of the Car 26 restoration. He worked extensively on Car 6, Car 2743 and 2168. He led those projects. He put his heart and soul into them. I was a college student in the Philadelphia area, and I got to know Harry, and he said, you really ought to take the train up to Newark and see PCCs. That's how I got my start with Newark cars. Harry, a number of the photos are his, and just a person who's always in it for the right motives. This presentation would not be possible without Harry. Bill Monahan. Bill's an exceptional photographer, as many of you know. Bill recently retired after a successful 37-year career in the transit industry. Bill was one of the last folks in Philadelphia for the original, if you want to say, PCCs to be qualified and operate on them. Bill also had the thankless job of taking a number of these photos, which were slides, and scanning them and attempting to clean them up and make something out of them. Bill did over 100 of these slides for me. Bill continues to help the Car 26 project. He's a trustee of the National Capital Trolley Museum. And again, thank you, Bill, for your help. Aaron Isaacs, who created the original program on the long lives of the Twin Cities PCCs, as well as Jim Vakunas from Minnesota Streetcar Museum. These two individuals are just wonderful folks. They helped with the Car 6 restoration some years back at Rock Hill with technical information, drawings, schematics, photos, and have been very helpful. The same with the 26. Aaron hosted me when I came out. I was in Minneapolis for business, hosted me so I could see Car 3 and the museum. Jim and Aaron are just, as the phrase goes, Midwestern nice, just great individuals who do a lot for preservation. Joel Salomon provided that great night photo of Car 6 and the 49 Plymouth together. Joel's been the president of the Rock Hill Trolley Museum for well over 2 decades. Helped support the Car 6 when it came there. Bill Wall, as I mentioned, I'm not sure any of the Newark cars would find homes in museums were it not for Bill. I think Bill still has a huge impact on the Trolley Museum world. Teaches us all how to play nice together, that we're all in this together, not in competition. And again, it'd be hard to say the Newark cars didn't have a better friend than Bill Wall. Kristen Fredrickson, who puts these programs together and coordinates this, gives up her evenings so we can all sit here and talk trolley cars and history, created the dynamite photo or collage we used. Thank you, Kristen, as always. And then finally, and certainly last but not least, the men and women of Public Service Coordinated Transport in New Jersey and NJ Transit. Kirk Wassung, among them. Kirk was the foreman of the city subway shop for many years, cared for these cars at a level that well beyond just a job. The fact that these cars ran as long as they did, they found homes. And Kirk's still willing to take phone calls from me or messages when I've got a question. The men and women who kept these cars running certainly deserve special mention. And finally, I like to end with this quote. I've used this in other Trolleyologies, but I think it speaks well from a museum perspective as to where we need to go. We're in this to survive. We're in this to grow and reach new generations. But the late Ken Rucker, longtime president of and de facto executive director of National Capital Trolley Museum, made it crystal clear his sentiments. So he told me the projects are becoming community-based. In the future, cooperation between museums will be how things get done. And I'd like to leave us all with that, especially as we see the cars in different homes. And at the end, at one time, the car 2 was commemorated. I'm not sure why 2. I like that car, but it was commemorated at Secaucus Junction train station in a mural. Not sure if it's still there, but for many years after it was retired, it lived on in the ceiling of Secaucus. And that'll wrap us up. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. I invite folks to turn their videos on, and I'll let you unmute yourselves in just a minute. But Matt, if you want to take a second to look through some of the awesome comments that are coming in, there were a few questions as well. I'm going to take a second to let folks know what is coming up here at the museum while you get a chance to look through those. Our next program will be on Cleveland's subway. So sticking with the subway theme. And the kind of starts and stops of that from author Craig Semsel, who wrote Built to Move Millions, a book that many of you probably have seen before. And then I mentioned earlier the Washington County Fair is coming up August 10th to 17th. In August, I'm excited to host a Streetcars of New Orleans presentation from a gentleman named Earl Hampton, who's written a couple books on New Orleans streetcars. And then in September, we'll be doing a virtual program jointly with the New York Transit Museum, and that'll be interesting. It'll be kind of like a museum exchange, and I'll be doing that. So that'll be me presenting for once, which is kind of scary. But hope you can join us in the future, and we'll keep these going as long as we have presenters. So as I mentioned earlier, if you have a presentation that you would like to share, please reach out. We're always looking for presenters. And we're so lucky to have Matt, who has given us at least four, five.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're always invited back because, I mean, your presentation spawned a lot of questions in my own mind. And let's see, I wrote a couple of those down somewhere. Well, actually, if you want to just go ahead and address any questions that you saw in the chat that popped up, we got lots of wonderful comments coming in.
Sure. I'm going to try and work through them here, folks.
Okay.
Do what I can, no problem. Just working through them. There's a comment, the city subway was intended to be a subway surface system like Philadelphia. Essentially, yes. 7 was the dedicated line that ran the subway, but every other line that operated in the subway basically entered through a ramp at different locations. Unfortunately, it shrunk. It would be as if though Philadelphia only ran, say, from 40th Street in was what was left with the 7. Comment, Ernie Moser preferred the air cars over all electrics. I've heard that too. Harry and Ernie were very close friends. He did, but I think Harry could chime in too. I don't think Ernie ever met a PCC he didn't like.
Yeah,
at least a photograph.
You're right. Ernie really loved the air cars, but that's what he broke in on in 1942.
Looking at a couple others, I'm thinking that in southern New Jersey, there's a route between Pleasantville and Atlantic City, or one of them, or Ocean City. I'm not aware of that. I know there was this planned Newark Elizabeth, I think they called it like Rail Link. I have the paperwork somewhere, but the intent was to use the cars there, is my understanding. But there were, to say that there may have been other concepts floated is certainly not out of line. It helped that the cars were stored underground. Yes, certainly did. They ran out in the open when they weren't in the subway, but during the day they were stored underground. That helped tremendously. Um, yes, North Jersey Electric Railway Historical Society's meeting was tonight, and it's unfortunate. I'm a member. I used to go to the meetings when I lived in New Jersey some years back. It's unfortunate some of their folks are conflicted, but since this will be put up on Zoom, hopefully it gives them the chance to watch it.
Quick question about New Jersey. What's the preservation landscape there? Like, I know you mentioned there's not like a public museum, but there are some things preserved in New Jersey, right?
Yes, they have. North Jersey Electric, for example, has several vehicles they own,
Okay.
but they're stored at basically non-public locations right now. It's probably the best way to put it. Their former public service compromise roof car, 2651, has been featured in the press. They did a little ceremony when they complete it, or at least substantially complete its restoration. But they don't have a public place to display it just yet.
Okay.
Looking through comments, number of people were there on the last day in Newark. Yes, they were. I was not, oddly enough. I was in the U.S. Navy at the time. I was at sea. Harry Donahue, Bill Monahan, the late Jerry Kelly from Baltimore, Roger Dupuy, mailed a series of care packages. Probably the only person on a destroyer in the U.S. Navy who about a month later got all sorts of packages with trolley photos and memorabilia on it. So I wasn't there. There may be other plans, but I was able to at least enjoy the experience through some care packages dropped off to a destroyer. There's a comment, the PCCs were wrapped to keep them protected. Yes, and I don't want to downplay that. Everything had pros or cons. It stopped some damage. Again, I think in hindsight, which is always 2020, if it had been breathable, that might have helped. It's certainly better than nothing at all. Comment made, safety security guy NJ Dot after he left had the cars cocooned. Entirely possible. I know a guy by the name of Al Fazio is involved in Hudson Bergen Light Rail, also played a role in that. Thanks for the positive comments. I really appreciate that from everybody. There's a lot of those. Thank you. The windshield configuration is unique is a question. Was this a purpose or just aesthetics? I'm going to ask for clarity on that one. If Lenore Bukta is still on the Zoom. I'm not sure if we're referring to the original windshields, the screen, or something else.
It might have been at the end. It was at the tail end of the presentation. I don't know if it was the ones that are in San Francisco or, yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay, I can come back to it too if somebody chimes in a little more. Thanks again for all the comments. Yeah, a lot of people like to see Subway. I do as well. Comment, the Silver Line is now provided by the U2s. Check the website. Yes, it does vary. When I was there last, the one U2 that used the line 1001 was out of service. Oddly enough, the PCCs were running. I know it varies. You can check the website. Typically, it's one car. I've had pretty good luck catching the PCCs, but yes, that's a good point. It does vary. It's interesting. They're probably the first place to run an LRV as a heritage car. So something to think about. A presentation, perhaps a future Trolleyology I've done for the transit industry through my work, talks about heritage operation and heritage cars in transit use. And at the end, I pose the question, so how do we define this? Still looks like a question to be answered.
I had a question actually that what you were just saying reminded me of it. So when the cars were stored for so long before they left the property, did they ever run any fan trips or they were just parked?
They were just parked.
Okay.
Now, one car at least, I'll just leave it there, was attempted to be moved at one point. Now, keep in mind the voltage. The line was 600 volts. It was later increased to 720 volts after the PCCs were retired. I won't go into the electrical engineering behind it, what you can and can't do. But let's put it this way. As the voltage was increased, it became a great way to find things like weak windings in MG sets. And one of the cars that was there ran under power to the end of the line. Coincidentally, it was a car that was moved, and when it was later inspected, it found basically there was a failure in the MG that looked like an overload. So that's the only time I know a car being moved under its own power, unfortunately. But it would have been tough too without the loop at Franklin Avenue. There is a loop at the new shop. Orange Street, you can only board and exit from the left. It would have been a challenge. Impossible, no, but definitely a challenge.
Lenore clarified about the curved passenger side windshield versus like normal straighter driver operator side window.
Okay.
That was in several PCCs of different cities, right? Or
yes, it had to do with there was to put it simply, for the post-war car body. This car, a Philadelphia 2700 post-war car, Pittsburgh 1700, that body, or the 1945 body. There were two different windshield configurations. One, if we go back to the photo of the Philadelphia 2743 and 6 side by side, you can see. Some used one type of window on the passenger side. Others, like 26, used a different type that then had what was called a shadow apron behind it. It's basically the type of front end the cars were built with. There were primarily two different front ends on St. Louis post-1945 cars. That's why the windshields look a little differently. Perhaps if you're from Philadelphia, Newark, if you want to say passenger door side windshield's going to look different. I see a comment. Any chance I'll do a presentation on the Market Frankfurt cars? Wow, that's tempting. We'll see. That's not a commitment, but on a personal level, it's probably the first, other than a bus, the first transit vehicle I rode growing up. I later rode them home from high school when they were used on the Norristown line. I know Harry Donahue's father worked at the Bud Company. Let's just say we're going to give that some consideration here. And PTM has 606 displayed, wonderfully. A profile photo of mine for some professional work is taken inside that car. So that's I'm going to think about that one. Harry, we got to talk, see if we want to do another one. Question: what's an amber glow headlight? Okay, that the term was golden glow. It's my fault if I mispronounced it. It was a patented design. What it had was a bulb, a traditional, if you want to say Edison type bulb, a screw-in type bulb, and behind it, it had a reflector that was coated, and it often was like a goldish color. It was basically to provide a brighter light. It was essentially a glorified reflector, but what it was made of and how it was made was patented. And the trademark name was Golden Glow. It's what virtually all PCC surface cars had. Bulbs became hard to get. The brightest golden glow would not produce as much light as a sealed beam automotive type headlight. That's why they kind of disappeared from PCC cars. There are replicas out there. San Francisco uses them in theirs. That's who actually made Harry and I wear them. We've used them in a number of projects.
Yeah, Matt, can you hear me?
Sure, Harry. Yeah, go ahead.
On the cars we've restored, like 2743 and 26, I get them from, there's an auto place, let me think, it's in Colorado, I think. And that's where I order them from. And you have to order them in pairs because they're for a 32 Ford. You can't order one, you have to order a pair. And they call it's evidently that's what something similar to that was used by the PCC builders. But they're made for a 32 Ford and you have to order a pair of them. That's where I get them from.
Fascinating.
Yeah, and it's really cool. And they use a modern bulb, which is
but it's got a big, it's got a modern bulb in it.
But you would never see behind the glass is really old-fashioned style, as Harry mentioned. They're used for antique auto restorations, and they look really cool. And like I said, you can also get a bulb for them, which is important. So folks have posted link to photos. I see that. Paul mentioned there's an APTA standard for heritage streetcars in transit use. Yes, there is. If you go to the APTA, I think it's public transit. If you search American Transportation Association, you will find, and you do a little searching, you'll find it. If I can find it before we're done, I'll post it in the chat. But it helps explain the difference between, standards for what would be used at a museum and what would be used at, in service. Certainly good standards, my own opinion, for museums to follow, but, not necessarily, it doesn't fall under the regulatory side of things. The museums, that, by and large, per se. How do they? Okay, Chris, I'm sorry. I'm just still tracking comments here.
Oh, so it didn't seem like the city subway was ever really in danger of being abandoned. Did the PCCs contribute to that? Like, how PCC saved a lot of streetcar systems. Did it have any role in, or did they have any role in, like, the longevity of the city subway? Or
sure, I would say yes, and here's why. The older cars were worn out. To put it to explain it very simply, I said the older cars were completely worn out. The court case itself was not a mandatory they have to get rid of them, but it was actually when I was in grad school trying to teach engineers some legal basics. We had access to a whole database. I started a little searching and found that the cars were tired. They were worn out. PCCs were the only game in town. If you wanted a modern streetcar, that sort of trolley car, these really depends. Or a streetcar that didn't really run on the street, but where else were you going to go to get one? The last new one had been built in 1952, so you're kind of limited. And public service, for some of its bus fleet, like some of its over-the-road coaches used during the war, had bought most of them secondhand. So buying secondhand equipment was not foreign to public service. And again, needed 30 cars, as Aaron covered in his presentation. Twin City Lines was basically having a fire sale. It's recently the Baltimore Streetcar Museum, we did a 2-part article on 26 and really dove into using a lot of Aaron's research as to why the car left. And it's funny, rail enthusiasts, the folks that did away with the leadership that did away with the Twin City Line system went to prison. While enthusiasts may think that getting rid of streetcars is worthy enough to be incarcerated, what happened was they defrauded the shareholders in the system. There were kickbacks involved, sale of equipment, cars to Mexico City. That will, defaulting your shareholders and stockholders will send you to prison. But their efforts made some of these cars available relatively dirt cheap, and right time, right place. And Newark got a fleet of new cars basically for less than half the cost.
George Rust asked, when was the last surface line to be abandoned? What was it? What ramps did it use to access the subway?
Sure. That was the 29. It used the ramps at, oh boy, I'm trying to remember where. I think it was Heller Parkway. I'd have to look back on the map. But it was a Bloomfield Avenue car line, Caldwell. Ironically enough, my grandmother was born in North Jersey, spent most of her youth in Caldwell, and rode the line. But she moved to Philadelphia prior to the city subway opening. So never saw its benefits in use. But yeah, it was the 29 Caldwell. And like I said, I believe it was Heller Parkway. I'd have to look back on the map where the ramps were. They're still there. Most of the ramps, you can see where at Warren Street the ramps are. Orange Street had a surface connection. There were ramps at Norfolk Street.
Okay, so I did set it, if anyone would like to ask a question directly, you should be able to unmute yourself, but we had a pretty good Q&A here just with questions in the chat. But if you would like to ask a question directly, now is your chance. Ooh, there's sirens outside here, so if you hear sirens, that's me. Okay, well then, I think we will go ahead and wrap it up there. Matt, thank you so much. This was great. Sure. Some great discussion here as well. You're always invited back. but I won't pressure you to work on that other presentation anytime soon.
Can I just ask one question?
Oh, sure, go ahead.
I thought I put it in there. Were any of the original fleet preserved? Are any available?
From the group, Gary, that was in the subway at the very end, no. Other than the flat car, basically, which was the former 2683, that's still in existence as a work car in its configuration. The public service compromise roof car owned by North Jersey Electric, 2651, identical to cars that ran in the subway, but it, as I recall Bob Hooper describing years ago, it was not one of the cars that went in the subway. It was retired some years before the cars in the subway retired, became a house. But it's identical, but it's not one of the cars that ran in the subway.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
All right. Well, thank you again, Matt. We hope to see you again soon. And thank you to everybody for joining us tonight. And thank you again to those who donated while registering for tonight's program. If you'd like to support the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum, you can head to patrolley.org/support. And I hope we see you again, maybe next month or maybe at the museum sometime this summer. Thank you again. Have a great night, everybody.
Night, night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.